Guys, what can I say about Sonic the Hedgehog 2 for this intro that hasn't already been said a bazillion times before? It is the second highest selling game for the Sega Mega Drive, right behind its predecessor, and is often regarded as the single best installment in the entire franchise. Like with all the main 16-bit Sonic titles, I have a special nostalgic connection here that I shall always carry with me, and therefore I love Sonic 2 as much as any other person who grew up playing it. After hearing my friend XEO Paradigm Gamer being critical of the game back in 2015 with his Remake or Rebreak episode, however, I've certainly opened up to the fact there could be flaws I've long been unaware of. It's now 2017, I have roughly 2 years of creating in-depth analysis videos under my belt, so it's time to throw my hat into the ring. Is Sonic the Hedgehog 2 still good? Let's find out. When it comes to the fundamentals of Sonic 2, there really isn't much I can say without echoing my Sonic 1 review. After doing some research on the development, I found no reason to believe that the base design philosophy Yuji Naka established for the original game wasn't followed here. Sonic 2 is a typical sequel with the same gameplay as before, only with fresh levels to play and hopefully previous flaws and shortcomings ironed out for a more enjoyable experience. There is one new addition to the mechanics though, and that is the spin dash. When at a standstill, holding down on the D-pad and then tapping the action button will make you rev up into a ball and allow a blast off at high speed right after releasing the D-pad. It's a very natural move that's right at home in a game like this, so natural that Sonic 1 in retrospect feels kinda naked without the spin dash, as you can gain a quick burst of momentum on the fly and automatically destroy defenseless foes on your path in this ball form. Gone are the days of needing to build up that momentum first in order to get up a steep hill of some kind, which, while it didn't bother me much, was seen as a bit of a hassle by others. Thankfully, because of it requiring that brief moment of stopping your forward motion and then charging up, the spin dash isn't as broken or out of control as you may initially think. The cover art and title screen make no secret of it that there is also a new kid in town this time around, Miles Tails Prower, Sonic's trusty sidekick. As far as my knowledge goes, there are two differences between the two playable characters, one of the differences being more significant that I'll get into later, and the second being that Tails has a slightly smaller hitbox due to having a slightly smaller sprite. It's only on the very rare occasion, however, that this has any impact on the game at all. I noticed that Sonic collects these rings without jumping, while Tails has to jump to collect the same rings, and Sonic always ends up getting crushed when he lands in between these blocks in chemical plants, while Tails never does. Outside of that, the change is merely cosmetic. It's kind of a bummer that Tails cannot fly, as he is shown to be capable of doing so when tagging along with Sonic, but I presume that decision was made to prevent the fox from breaking the level design. Speaking of Tails tagging along with Sonic, by default this is enabled, basically meaning that Tails is sort of passively handled by an AI and copying your movement here and there. For companionship, I guess. In my opinion, this would have been best turned off by default, since while it can help you out, it can also negatively affect your gameplay, and especially when tackling the special stages, having Tails with you is a major handicap. We'll get to that, don't you worry for a second. Tails coming along was clearly a feature put in for a second player to lend some assistance, which is notably beneficial during boss fights. It's a cool novelty. I cannot directly think of any other game that has anything like this, but it's definitely not a real co-op offering because the focus is always on Sonic. The second player will constantly find themselves going off screen and thus not getting many chances to participate in the action. With these small additions to Sonic 2 covered, let's dive into that adventure proper, shall we? It all begins at Emerald Hill Zone, a lush tropical landscape similar to Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1. As the introductory area, it doesn't have many special gimmicks going for it, and the difficulty is low with few hazards and mostly passive enemies, but it does set the tone quite well that Sonic 2 is generally going to be a faster game than its predecessor. Where Green Hill has 3 loop-de-loops across 3 acts to race through, Emerald Hill sports as many as 9 across 2 acts, often stringing 2 of them together to allow the player to pick up even more speed and blaze through set pieces, such as these new corkscrew lanes that show off flashy, rotating sprites for our heroes. In addition to demonstrating some amped up speed, Emerald Hill also has tons of secrets to discover in the level design. You'll often find passageways in the walls that contain rings or extra lives to collect, and there are plenty of small floating islands high up for even more hidden goodies to find. While some of these secrets are reached by the simple act of being curious and thoroughly exploring, others require knowledge of the momentum and physics. In Act 2, for example, there is this loop-de-loop with a shield monitor on top of it, as well as a spring that bounces you toward a big pocket of rings and an extra life. In order to get on top of said loop-de-loop though, you'll need to jump off of the terrain before it with the right amount of speed, the right angle, and the right amount of control correction in midair. Odds are that you'll fall short if you don't properly execute all of these things. The new spin dash can also be put to good use. Not only does it make traversal of the land more efficient on the whole, since you no longer have to backtrack and gain momentum for steep hills, some of the obstacles even require the player to use it because there isn't enough ground before them to build up a sufficient amount of speed. Similarly, a couple of the aforementioned passageways in the walls are only within reach of a spin dash launched off of a slope. Thankfully, secrets are ever so present throughout the entirety of Sonic 2. Whether it be a ring box, an extra life, speed shoes, a shield, invincibility stars, or a checkpoint. Why checkpoints are important is something I'll get to later. You can find so much of this goodness, and it really adds to the explorability of all the stages. In Chemical Plant Act 1, for instance, you can see these 3 ring boxes below you at the very start of the level, but it's up to you to figure out how to get there. Then, in Hilltop, you can spend some extra time with many of the seesaws to get fired higher and higher, and use that to reach locations with goodies, as well as spin dash back through this loop-de-loop, go back down, and use the gain velocity to get to these 3 ring monitors. The spin dash is actually utilized often to reach secret areas and whatnot, requiring good timing and angles to get to them. To be frank, I could be talking about this stuff and listing examples for 10 minutes, if not longer, but at some point we gotta move on. Suffice it to say that no zone is left out when it comes to this juiciness, and it tends to bring out how deep the physics system in classic Sonic truly is. A good example is again found in Chemical Plant here. You cannot quite reach these goodie monitors if you charge up a spin dash before this loop-de-loop and fly off the ramp ahead, but if you charge up a spin dash, then at a specific point of the loop, jump down to the bottom of it, you gain just that extra bit of speed from the downwards jump to reach that ledge with the goodie monitors on it. Like I said in the Sonic 1 review, the controls are so ridiculously nuanced for a platformer, and people absolutely did not moan about the sluggish physics in Sonic the Hedgehog 4 just to be petty. No, the physics are a defining characteristic of the Mega Drive originals. Combined with the semi-linear design of most of the levels, veterans have got so much to sink their teeth into, while those who don't care can choose to ignore the optional mini-challenges for items. That said, it's been over 15 years since I first started playing this sucker on my Mega Drive, and I'm still discovering many new nooks and crannies I had never seen before. Sonic 1 also nails this, so this whole discussion may seem superfluous, but I'm just happy to report that Sonic 2 follows suit in nailing it. In any case, after the bright and lively Emerald Hill, we move on to the gritty and industrial Chemical Plant. If I had to get the point of this zone across in 3 words, it would be blast processing, bitch. The amount of speed you can acquire here is cranked up to shit-hundred and fuck, with a lot of boosters launching you forward at a high velocity, steep downward slopes, and a ton of loop-de-loops, at times allowing you to move so quickly that the screen starts having trouble keeping up with you. Merge these satisfying antics with some badass and out-of-control music that I absolutely love, and I always have a dang old fun time here. The argument could be made, though, that playing through Chemical Plant can feel shallow in terms of player interaction because there is a good amount of automation. Part of that is true, and it mostly applies to these tubes that transport you to your next destination. It's not very exciting to watch, if you ask me, so you're essentially getting nothing out of the game for 5 seconds or so each time. Fortunately, none of this ever lasts too long to be really problematic, and while Act 1's upper route may be mostly hold right to win, if you venture into the bottom half of the level, there are more platforms to jump on and interfering hazards to avoid, with the advantage of containing a lot more rings and things like that to get your hands on. Act 2 doesn't really have this path separation, but it sprinkles platforming sections in between the spectacle to keep the player engaged. And near the end, there is even a part in a vertical shaft with blocks that move about in a pattern, and rising water to create potential for players to drown if they're too slow. It's definitely a bit of tense and challenging platforming that is anything but mindless. What's great is that you can skip this particular area too, either by jumping off of this slope here with the correct timing to be launched upwards past the vertical shaft, or by taking the upper path at this split and then spin dashing into a hole in the wall a little further ahead. This takes you to a secret route that dumps you at the boss scot-free by the end of it. Both methods are a wonderful combination of clever thinking and mechanical mastery being required, and they allow those who don't like the slow water segment to skip it altogether. The third zone, Aquatic Room, has something similar going for it. This can easily give flashbacks to Sonic 1's Labyrinth, where you have to navigate an underwater obstacle course under the mercy of drastically reduced momentum, bogging down the overall pace of the levels. Luckily, the key improvement that Aquatic Room makes is including higher routes that offer an alternative for those who do not like being submerged at all. As long as you ensure you don't venture too far down at any point, you'll never have to touch the water and can race through each act of this beautiful part of nature in 30 seconds or so. This is awesome, and while Act 1 makes it easy to stay on the high ground, Act 2 as a progression makes some active attempts to have you fall down into the water with tricky platforming you must overcome successfully. If you do accidentally land underwater, however, you can still create opportunities for yourself to launch out of it back onto land with careful use of the spin dash and curved terrain. That said, even the underwater portions in Aquatic Room are relatively fast-paced. The spin dash helps with that, of course, but with some nosing around, you can find speed shoes to restore most of your normal speed, and the layout itself often allows you to blaze along for a bit before going back into slower gameplay. It's overall less claustrophobic and cramped than Labyrinth is. The end result is a zone that clearly demonstrates Sonic Team having learned from a past mistake and fixing it for the sequel. One complaint I do have is that Aquatic Room sometimes has a few too many paths crisscrossing one another and twisting and curling around each other. This can make it hard to get a grasp on how certain areas of the level design are organized and how to access them. It's an interesting experiment of level design, I'll give it that, but I don't think having so many overlapping layers adds much, and the switching between them can easily cause minor glitches that look very sloppy to boot. Next up is Casino Night, and this is easily one of the most unique zones, if not the most unique zone in all of the classic Sonic titles if you ask me. In some ways, it's like Spring Yard from the original, which has a few buildings in the background and bumpers as an interactive stage gimmick. But Casino Night expands on these aspects and then some. The visuals are absolutely gorgeous, with a backdrop consisting of a city with moving lights, and the objects you interact with are all so colorful and flashy. It's truly pleasant and stunning art direction backed up by an oh so sexy jazz piece, and it all works incredibly well with the actual gameplay. See, this zone is essentially a gigantic casino playground. There are pinball flippers to knock you to different places, a variety of bumpers that bounce you around as the ball that you are, small elevators that take you from set piece to set piece, and perhaps most importantly of all, slot machines. These can be entered to rack up a ton of rings. 3 times jackpot will grant you no less than 150, but you can also get a mixture of other icons to win lower prizes. However, you always run the risk of losing 100 of your rings every time you're unfortunate enough to get 3 Robotnik faces. It is basically gambling for all ages, and we all know how addictive gambling can be for some people. Really, Casino Night is just plain fun to hang around in, and it gives the game's physics so much room to shine due to all the gimmicks Sonic and Tails can interact with. We all remember this part with the arrangement of different bumpers being placed in such a way that it was difficult to advance, don't we? Unless you get lucky, passing this section requires some proper manipulation of the physics to carefully squeeze your way through. That's the type of challenge this zone is filled to the brim with, and I love that. It's barely a dangerous or otherwise difficult part of the game, but that's the goal, you know, being easygoing and kind of emulating a night out in Las Vegas. Casino Night was in fact so popular that it inspired the entire existence of the 1993 spin-off Sonic Spinball. Despite Casino Night being one of my favorites in the game though, it does highlight the concern that parts of Sonic 2's level design can feel like a bit of a maze to navigate. While it's cool to have so many paths and secrets on one hand, on the other it may be difficult to tell where you're at times and how the various pathways and bits and pieces in an act connect together. I bring up Casino Night as the main offender because there are so many damn options at so many points. Look at this map of the second act. When you're actually playing and you don't have the whole thing zoomed out out for you, being in some of these nooks and crannies can make you feel lost. Aquatic Room suffers from a similar issue of being too busy with all of its mixing layers, as I've discussed, and Oil Ocean is another example where you don't necessarily have endless options of where to head next, but these hot balloon cannon things tend to shoot you what seems like all across the stage from right to left and back again, and hot mama, where am I even going? Truthfully speaking, I can certainly understand why people would find some of Sonic 2's zones too busy in terms of design and even visuals. Simultaneously, I cannot say I am personally very bothered by this, as the developers ensured that you're always getting closer to the signpost no matter the pathway you're taking. It's nigh impossible to really get stuck with no clue how to proceed despite the complexity of some of the stages. It's arguably still poor practice in this case to make players feel like they're lost, and not everybody will dig it, but I can hardly classify it as a major detraction to the experience. It's admittedly not ideal, but I suppose having a game filled with as many hard to discover secrets as Sonic 2 is bound to make a trade-off somewhere and somehow. And it's certainly not like every zone is this way. The fifth one, Hilltop, is probably the most straightforward of the game, alongside Emerald Hill and the later Winged Fortress. You've still got multiple pathways present here, but you're rarely given more than 2 to choose from at once, and where they start and end is obvious. Now, does that make Hilltop superior to something like Casino Night? In some eyes, most likely, but other folks may argue that Hilltop not being as stuffed with goodies and little secrets as Casino Night makes it not as enjoyable. It's a good thing then that Sonic 2 sports both types of zones, as it not only gives both camps something to look forward to, but it also enhances the diversity aspect for people like me who are completely fine with either. You know, as much as it may seem like it, I do not hold on to some kind of belief that more straightforward levels with less multiple paths and whatnot is inherently bad for a Sonic title. As long as they continue to properly complement the unique mechanics and playstyle of Sonic, something Marble and Labyrinth in the original do not do very well, then I don't mind more linear layouts. So in the same way I like to think of Aquatic Ruin as an improved Labyrinth, I like to think of Hilltop as an improved Marble. Where Marble is extremely linear, pretty claustrophobic, and force you to wait or do mundane tasks quite often to advance, Hilltop strikes a respectable balance between speed, platforming, and exploration with at least some diverging roads. There are various sections of platforming in the form of moving platforms above rising lava, as well as the seesaws returning from Starlight, but it also contains tunnels and loop-de-loops that you roll through at a high speed and then maybe launch out of to skip a slower part or reach a higher route. Much like virtually the entirety of Sonic 2, the zone shifts between spectacle and platforming at regular intervals, giving it a nice sense of speed and pacing. At worst, you have to sit your ass out on these chairlifts, bringing you to your next destination. But even that isn't very common, nor does it take long, and usually it can be skipped with some memorization or repeat playthroughs. Honestly, outside of the rather bland aesthetics and music, I'm struggling to mention some kind of notable downside to Hilltop. It's a well-designed zone. Moving on, we have Mystic Cave, our 6th zone on the list, and one of my personal favorites in the game. And I honestly would have a hard time giving proper arguments as to why. In terms of gameplay, there isn't a ton to talk about here that doesn't already apply to earlier zones, and there aren't many standout gimmicks or traits. The most notable additions are the vines Sonic and Tails must grab onto to access new sections of the levels, and these crushing things that you have to time your jumps through or else you, well, get crushed. You've also got the most tricky platforming yet in the form of moving platforms over spikes, as well as having to jump onto the mentioned tiny vines with precision from a distance and jumping onto small platforms surrounded by rotating spike balls. Outside of that, I'd say the zone could have done with a couple more unique components, like minecarts or something. They are synonymous with cave levels in gaming, and the tracks leading along in the background practically look like they are built for minecarts. Nevertheless, I can always just get into Mystic Cave and feel joyous. I'm guessing the presentation must play an integral role in that, because I do legitimately fancy the cave aesthetic that, while it's dark in some way, also remains colorful with a great contrast of green and purple. The background tune is good stuff in addition. It has a sexy-ass twang bass line, and the main lead sounds pretty unsettling, but that doesn't take away from any of it being memorable and catchy. You know, Mystic Cave may not be that noteworthy when trying to praise or critique it at this point of the review, but if anything, the fact it doesn't feel repetitive or boring to play through regardless shows how solid the main Sonic 2 formula is. It's that frequent switching between bursts of fast and then various bits of platforming, along with multiple pathways and the plethora of secrets to find as to be expected, that makes for well-flowing and replayable level design and gives the game its own sort of style that is hardly found anywhere else. It's perfect for the speedrunners, but also for the more explorative types. To give credit where it is due, Sonic 1 started that formula, but the designers took what worked and didn't work so well when it comes to layout and terrain there, and applied that knowledge to the vast majority of the levels in the sequel. Some zones are certainly faster than others or have kind of a different focus than others. For example, Chemical Plant focusing on spectacle and speed, and Casino Night on physics manipulation. But the feel remains appropriately Sonic throughout. The result is an experience that's a more cohesive whole rather than a disjointed and experimental adventure that doesn't quite know what it wants to be. This also benefits the difficulty curve, which is flip-floppy in Sonic 1 because of the Sonic-y and non-Sonic-y zones alternating one another, but relatively stable now in the sequel precisely because the level design is more consistent. It's up to interpretation whether it scales 100% correctly from zone to zone to zone, but as a rough outline, Emerald Hill as the beginning as a cakewalk, Hilltop and Mystic Cave around the halfway point of the game are considerably more challenging, and Wing Fortress at the end is lethal as hell the moment the title card disappears. The difficulty disparity in the original isn't a deal breaker, I find, but it's nice that Sonic 2 doesn't have the same striking oddity. Another favorable change brought to the table is how the zones are handled. In the original game, there are a total of 6 zones with 3 acts each, making for a total of 18 regular stages. In the sequel, there are a total of 19 regular stages, but they're spread across 7 zones containing 2 acts, 1 zone containing 3 acts, and then 2 zones containing 1 act. This means that even though there are about as many stages in both titles, the assortment of different environments in Sonic 2 is quite a bit larger. In retrospect, it's perhaps unfair to say 3 acts per zone is a little excessive, but it is how many people feel. After all, you can only show the same environment and rearrange a pull of level gimmicks in different setups so often before they start wearing themselves thin. Again, I wouldn't say it's a big detriment to Sonic 1, but going for 2 acts per zone with Sonic 2, Metropolis not included, was undoubtedly a smart decision and makes for another one of the game's substantial leaps forward. I'm just saying, if you compare Sonic 1 to 2 in your head with the amount of content they provide, the latter is sure to come out on top, while both have around the same amount of levels in reality. Because there are more zones, there are also more bosses, but like before, these aren't going to be winning any awards. Robotnik makes numerous attempts to annihilate Sonic and Tails with various new contraptions, but a lot of them fall into simple patterns that are easy to deal with. It could be a car with a giant drill on the front moving from one side of the screen to the other, to a mining machine that digs into the ceiling and drops hurtful spikes that you gotta avoid as they're falling piece by piece. With a few exceptions, the encounters with this clown don't have advancing phases, so once you can land the first hit, you can land all the others without any need to develop. It should be noted though that like in Sonic 1, most of these battles can be won in a whim once you know the trick to speed them up. You can jump onto the Chemical Plant boss as soon as it comes on screen and get a freebie victory after 8 bounces. You can stand on these poles in Aquatic Room to get painless access to the Fat Doctor until he flees the area, and you can bop on top of Robotnik's cockpit repeatedly when he rises from the oil or lava in Oil Ocean and Hilltop respectively, wait an attack cycle, and then deliver the finishing blow. The bosses are not the star of the show, as should be apparent, but at least the majority do not drag in the slightest, and as such I view them as harmless at worst and mildly interesting at best. Under the mildly interesting ones, I mostly count the Casino Night boss and the Wing Fortress boss. The Casino Night boss because you're in a pinball-like area and can use the structure, bumpers, flippers, and general physics to land on top of or slam into Robotnik from various angles. It's playful and allows you to tackle the fight in a variety of ways, making it sort of captivating as far as I'm concerned, and even replayable in an odd sense. As for the Wing Fortress boss, it's decently challenging, believe it or not. You're locked in this tight-ass room with 3 small spiky platforms that move around and hurt to the touch on the sides, while trying to make precise landings on any of them to reach the laser in the ceiling when it opens up. This is a battle that many people actually die to, if not multiple times, and for that it is noteworthy. Granted, it is only difficult because rings literally clip through the ceiling and barriers at the sides, preventing players from re-grabbing their scattered gold, but since Since I think the ring system sucks anyway for bosses, it unintentionally benefits the situation if you ask me. If I had to pick the worst Robotnik mobile you go up against, outside of the final boss, Jesus Christ, it would definitely be the one in Metropolis, which has a group of balls rotating around the main body at rapid speed, and each hit leads to one ball turned into a balloon that you need to pop. You most likely won't be dying to this thing or whatever, but the first 2 hits or so require an insane sense of timing to connect without taking damage. The concept is cool, I'll admit that, but ultimately the developers designed a lazy boss and could get away with it due to the ring system. On the topic of the ring system, it feels like Sonic 2 still relies on it as a crutch for a familiar problem: sloppy enemy and hazard placement. As early as Emerald Hill, you can find yourself falling onto monkeys or fish below you that you couldn't quite see simply by interacting with stage elements in the way they are intended to be used, and getting launched into spikes in the ceiling or on the ground by hidden springs that you didn't know would magically pop out. It's annoying stuff, and for the first zone to allow things like this to happen on a consistent basis could potentially leave a bad taste in a newcomer's mouth. Then there's Mystic Cave with its spiked pillars that move out of the walls with no visual indication or warning whatsoever. Occasionally, if you pay very close attention and have lightning reflexes, you can see a part of these hazards through the walls, but 9 times out of 10, you'll get blindsided if you stand still for a split second in these areas. Granted, you'll become suspicious when it comes to approaching walls sooner than later once you've been bitten a few times, but a slightly reduced speed on the movement of the pillars and better projection of these traps lurking around would have resolved the issue entirely. If that wasn't enough spikes for you, they still haven't laid off the ones periodically ejecting from the walls or ground out of nowhere either. I really could have stood to see these removed, as they are so blatantly cheap, it's not even funny. A general overhanging shortcoming that pesters Sonic 2 as well is the troublesome visibility, which has not been fixed or mitigated. Our heroes still move too fast when simply holding down the D-pad, and this time around I cannot forgive the lack of a panning screen. Sonic 2 is a faster game than its predecessor, so why there isn't a system in place now to shift the screen depending on the direction you're heading is beyond me. I realize that the spin dash can partially resolve the problem since you are invulnerable to many enemies in ball state, but that doesn't apply to all the enemies, and stage hazards don't care about your precious spin dash at all. It is, sadly, equally as much of a theme throughout the adventure as it was in Sonic 1 for players to not be able to react to many of the upcoming obstacles and threats sufficiently. In fact, I think the enemy and hazard placement may be worse here taken on the whole. Scrap Rain is also pretty darn obnoxious in the first game, don't get me wrong, but at least it's only one significantly cheap zone. I have very consciously spaced discussion about Mystic Cave and Oil Ocean far apart. The reason is that, while I consider Mystic Cave and everything before it not any more guilty than Sonic 1 when it comes to questionable design, from Oil Ocean onward it feels like Sonic 2's quality just takes a dump and barely ever recovers. As a disclaimer, I do want to say that I do still like Oil Ocean somewhat, as the platforming is pretty intricate. You've got bridges that collapse underneath your feet to jump off from in time, fans that periodically turn on that you can use to hover over gaps, and these bursting steam vents that can give you a lift to higher places. The stuff you have to do is fairly precise, and there are plenty of spikes and drops to earlier parts of the levels to punish you for failing to show the expected skill. I also get a kick out of these oil slide set pieces carried over from the Labyrinth water slides in Sonic 1, and the music in this zone is one of my favorites of the whole soundtrack. Something about the funky bass line and drum beat, the slightly dire yet highly memorable melody, and the general instrumentation of all the channels just grabs me. However, despite the positives I've mentioned about Oil Ocean, there are a couple of negatives that bring it down. The minor beef I have, these checkerboarded balloon cannon things that transport you through the levels. Sitting in them is just watching cutscenes like the tubes in chemical plants, only these can take upwards of 10 seconds at worst at a time, and sometimes the cannons shoot you through more of them than it feels necessary. Not the end of the world again, but worth mentioning. Now, the major beef I have ties back directly into the enemy and hazard placement subject, because it's on an eerily regular basis that I get sniped by bullets spit out by the seahorses and octopuses that are lurking around. I don't know if it's just my bad luck or whatever, but every time I play through this zone, after over 15 years of experience playing Sonic the, I cannot seem to hold on to my reins, and it's always the obnoxious badniks chilling outside the borders of the screen and surprising you that are the source of this irritation. This is a zone where the panning screen would have made all the difference, as it would have granted the player that extra bit of reaction time and thus made Oil Ocean enjoyable to a bigger degree. Regardless of how messy you may believe this zone is though, nothing could prepare players, or should I say victims, for what's around the corner. Enter Metropolis, the zone with a name that clearly a certain YouTube channel producing sexy ass analytical reviews took inspiration from, but fuck me, is it an abomination of level design. I don't know what happened here, but it's evident that somebody during the development of Sonic 2 was determined to make players feel absolutely miserable when playing through these stages. Spikes on the ceiling that you run or spin dash right into before you can see them? Check. Pools of lava that the player can easily run or roll into without any warning? Check. Dickheads showing up out of nowhere in the middle of the road to ambush you? Check. It's literally as if you cannot go half a minute at a time, or perhaps even less, without shenanigans like these happening, and the issues extend well beyond just lackluster visibility. I frequently was straight up flung into crap by the bumpers that bounce Sonic and Tails around, which reaches an absurd level of bollocks with this sighter standing at the edge at this particular part. You have little, if any, influence over how you bounce around between these bumpers, so how are you supposed to destroy or dodge this guy without getting hit? As far as I know, there is no reliable way, and the fact that I still can never manage to properly get rid of him unless I get lucky somehow is a testament to how asinine the whole situation is. Badniks waiting by ledges like mean bullies is actually a Metropolis staple in general. I have so much footage of it. And this can be a big pain in the butt when you're aboard these threaded bolts that you use to vertically climb the stages, are about to reach the top of a particular thread, and then get slammed off by a robot well prepared for your arrival that you couldn't see in time. Now you have to backtrack a little bit to make the bolt respawn at the bottom, and then make that whole climb a second time. Fan-fucking-tastic. The only badniks that I ironically don't mind are the Staryus in the walls that shoot out 5 needles in different directions. A lot of people criticize them, but I don't see a good reason to. Their triggers are a bit dodgy, sometimes they activate and sometimes they don't, but they have a decently long load-up animation to them, and then it's up to you to position yourself in between the needles. If anything, I think that's engaging enemy design, which I appreciate. As strange as this may sound, it's not like Metropolis is solely made up of terrible elements. It has potential with some of its platforming challenges that require healthy precision and timing, for instance. But any and all potential the zone may have is simply overshadowed by the endless ways it possesses of screwing over players hardcore. Oh boy, Metropolis is quite a 3-act stinker zone. Need a breather after it? Sky Chase is that relaxed zone for you to relieve some stress before the finale. This stage is pretty much an interactive cutscene where you sit on the tornado while it gives chase towards Robotnik Air Fleet and listen to a gorgeous piece of music that is incredibly nostalgic for me. Despite its peaceful and calming function though, Sky Chase is quite frankly uninteresting to sit through, shamefully enough, especially on repeat playthroughs. The pace at which you move along is fully dictated by the game itself, and though some Sky Troops are sent your way in spades, the rings make taking hits practically a non-issue, and thus there is barely any danger. You can't even get 100 rings here, so the incentive to avoid damage for an extra life in the end also doesn't exist. The level is only a 2-minute long affair if I had to look at the bright side of it, but a bit more excitement would not have hurt. Maybe they could have given the tornado a health bar and projectiles, making Sky Chase sort of like a one-off shoot-'em-up level. It would feel out of place for a Sonic title, sure, but I'd take that over the current bore that it is. Once Sonic and Tails catch up to Robotnik's air fleet though, Wing Fortress begins, and this is the only part from Oil Ocean and onward that I could actually label as good. It's appropriately the most lethal zone found in the adventure, but largely in a legitimate satisfying manner, not in the sadistic manner of Metropolis. There is quite a lot of taxing platforming here over a gigantic abyss below, from jumping from platform to platform via bars you hold onto, to small platforms you have to quickly jump across before they disappear underneath your feet, and this is definitely the most linear stage on display in Sonic 2. Since Wing Fortress is meant to really test your mettle, however, I think a more linear stage progression provides the best amount of focus for that. I've already elaborated on this in the Sonic 1 review, but the more linear you make a level, the easier it is to create a set of nuanced challenges that the developers can put all their attention toward. For such a late level in the game, I think that approach is completely welcomed, and even then, it's not like there aren't some nice shortcuts to find if you are willing to think outside the box. You can jump through these propellers here and get sucked upwards, skipping the first chunk of dangerous platforming in the stage, and you can even abuse invincibility frames to pass through the propellers here to jump over to a much later section. For being a linear stage, there are also a surprising amount of secrets to stumble across if you let your curious side take over, which rewards the explorers between us with some extra lives to stock up in preparation for the true showdown against Robotnik. But in spite of my fondness of Wing Fortress, there are two needlessly dumb parts that irk me to no end. The first is the brief intro where the tornado is lasered down by Robotnik's ship. At some point you are supposed to take control yourself and abandon the tornado, but there is an invisible barrier around you that magically disappears without warning. This can potentially cause players to either jump prematurely and then get flung into the abyss when said invisible barrier unexpectedly unlocks, or cause them to wait for too long and thus get carried down with the tornado to their doom. Both of these deaths would stem from arbitrary scenarios rather than a lack of skill, and therefore the possibilities of them happening should have been fully eliminated in some fashion. Secondly, there are these launcher things in this section that full-on kill you if you happen to hold the direction you're sent in. There is absolutely no clue or hint that would lead one to believe you should release the D-pad when you're about to get launched, and therefore I don't think any further explanation is necessary why this is some garbage. Sadly, I'm afraid surprise instant kill scenarios aren't exclusive to just Wing Fortress. As early as Chemical Plant, you'll find these platforms that periodically appear and disappear, causing you to fall through them in the latter situation, and if you're unlucky enough, you can run up to the boss in Act 2 and plunder straight into the abyss below before it can even really sink in what you're dealing with. Similarly, you can get crushed by ruins dropping from above out of nowhere on multiple occasions in Aquatic Room, and Mystic Cave has the infamous deep pit with spikes at the bottom that one could run into before he or she properly sees it. If you're Supersonic, there's an added bonus of having to let your rings run out in order to move on with the game. Brilliant. Now, of course, Sonic 1 also has its share of these examples. I covered that in the review pretty clearly. But I can't help but feel it's a more significant issue in Sonic 2. Perhaps I am just picking up on tripe like this more in Sonic 2 than I was in Sonic 1. I wouldn't deny it if that's true, but I don't suspect him off base here. Even if that's still the case, issues should be resolved or at the very least lessened in a sequel, not kept the same as in a predecessor and certainly not more than in a predecessor. I suspect what may have cemented my idea that Sonic 2 has it worse than Sonic 1 is how poorly designed the Death Egg Zone is, housing Mecha Sonic and the true final boss, the Death Egg Robot. To be fair, Mecha Sonic isn't really so bad. You have to jump into his head at an angle to prevent yourself from touching the spikes grinding on the top and back of his head. I like this precision involved with the controls and landing. It makes defeating the boss a little more intricate than just jumping on him, though I don't like the way they handled him dashing across the screen. The first time he dashes along the ground, so you can just jump over him if you kept enough distance, but the second time he jumps into the air shortly after taking off, which messes with the player's expectations and feels rather cheap. Other than that gripe, you can beat Mecha Sonic very swiftly and easily, so whatever. Really, the true shitsucker of the show is the Death Egg Robot. All this boss is waiting for the bastard to step toward you until he stands still. He then flies up, you let him drop down into a corner without you getting crushed, jump into his cockpit as he bends his knees and lunges forward, and then you run away to the other side to prevent yourself from getting nuked by the spiked hands fired off. Problem number one is that it's a boring ass fight, as you barely do anything during the entire process I've laid out, and the guy takes no less than 12 hits. The whole endeavor can literally take upwards of 4 minutes once you've figured out how to damage this final contraption. Problem number two is exactly that. figuring out how to deal damage to begin with. Because it takes a while for the opportune moments to arrive, there is a good amount of time during which players will naturally try to attack Robotnik, only for them to touch the spiked hands in all likeliness, and thus die as a result. It's such an unintuitive final boss, because aimlessly standing and running around until one specific event in the battle is not at all how you've been dealing with any of the Robotnik encounters prior. The issue is exacerbated by the fact that you have to refight Mecha Sonic when you get killed here, and that Death Egg Zone contains no rings whatsoever. Oh boy, look, I understand that the developers wanted to make the finale challenging, I totally do, but asking players to perform flawlessly with no room for error is simply mad. It is true that Sonic 1's final zone also doesn't contain any rings, but that only has one boss, a boss that is actually intuitively designed and has properly telegraphed attacks, I might add. The Death Egg robot lacks those qualities, and if anything, it perfectly highlights the core flaw I've so often addressed with the ring system. Finding that balance for a boss fight between being too easy with a lot of possible brute forcing and being ridiculously difficult and cheap is not an easy job. Before I get called out on this by the YouTube comment Nazis, I am aware that you can barely reach the cockpit of the final boss as it's walking toward you. This makes the fight a heck of a lot shorter and more rewarding to overcome in my eyes, but the amount of precision demanded in your jump timing and control is too high for anybody else than series pros to even attempt. I'm glad it's a possibility at all for people like me, but it doesn't make the Death Egg robot any more reasonable for newcomers who would get their butt spanked in the first place. Also, on one of my playthroughs as Tails, this funky glitch happened to me 6 times in a row, and I have no idea why. I was fucking livid. A plausible explanation for all of Sonic 2's lesser moments could be that it was rushed. According to Mark Cerny, head of Sega Technical Institute in San Francisco at the time, development on the game was planned to start in September of 1991, but it was said to be much too soon for a sequel to the original Blue Blur Killer app. However, the marketing team came around 2 months later and wanted Sonic 2 to be ready for 1992's holiday season, and so only 9 months out of an 11-month schedule remained. This time loss led to various game concepts and zones ultimately getting axed, such as the well-known Hidden Palace as well as the Cyber City, a one-act zone that was meant to follow Metropolis and instead was converted into the third act of Metropolis. Furthermore, to meet the deadline, 13 additional staff members from Sega of Japan flew over to San Francisco to weed out as many problems as possible merely a few weeks before release, and some things were changed or created at the last minute. All of this is to say that the development cycle of Sonic 2 evidently wasn't a very comfortable one, which, as I said earlier, could explain why the game feels rough around the edges. There is also a critically important bug that seems to further cement the rushed nature, which is how you are likely to softlock and have to reset the console if you jump over or past the signpost as Supersonic. This is such a simple to trigger, yet hugely game-breaking issue, and I assume it would have been caught and fixed had the team been given some more time. It makes me wonder then if things like that, as well as the visibility issues, instant kill trash, and the Death Egg robot boss I've discussed earlier, are intentionally designed with the purpose to create artificial difficulty, a byproduct of rushed development, or perhaps a mixture of both. A zone like Metropolis is such nasty vomit that I start leaning toward intentional cheapness, but on the other hand, Sonic 2 is packed with small details that alleviate or otherwise at least minimize unfair moments. Many stages have these small slopes that temporarily halt your forward momentum, giving you a smidge more time to observe what's just ahead of you and react appropriately, while Hilltop in particular has a habit of placing boulders in your way that prevent you from running into upcoming enemies, bottomless pits, or lava. Chemical Plant has spider creatures that catch you but can be escaped before they inflict damage by rapidly pressing the action button, ensuring a possibility for players to not lose their rings even though they didn't see the spider coming initially, while Aquatic Room has trees shooting out arrows after passing them. The eyes of Robotnik's face start blinking, indicating danger, and you're granted a chance to either outrun the arrow or jump over it. Spikes no longer penetrate right through your invincibility frames like in Sonic 1 either, so landing on a bed of them can very much be survived, and you cannot get bounced from one set of spikes right into another. Thoughtful touches glitches and improvements like the ones I've just listed suggest that Sonic Team was actually making an effort to shape a fair play experience, so that's when I'm inclined to chalk many of the game's lesser moments up to the rushed production. I'd like to give the developers the benefit of the doubt on all fronts, but in the end I suppose it's up in the air what precisely caused what in terms of Sonic 2's flaws. Something that I wish was abandoned by now, however, is the limited continues principle. I just don't see why it's needed when the game has plenty of replay value of its own, and it compounds upon the sloppy and trial and error heavy nature of certain parts of the game. At the very least, you can still amass a bunch of extra lives by exploring the levels per usual, and the method to obtaining continues is improved. Well, half improved. In Sonic 1, you have to enter a special stage and snoop up a total of 50 rings in said special stage in order to be granted a continue. In Sonic 2, players are granted a continue when they finish an act with a combined time and ring score of 10,000 points. I found a table on Sonic Retro that confirms how the time points are awarded. Under 30 seconds is 50,000, under 45 seconds is 10,000, under a minute is 5,000, etc, etc, and you get 100 points per ring that you bring to the end of a stage. On one hand, I believe this to be an improvement, seeing how speed now forms an important aspect. You also don't have to collect 50 rings in stupefying rotating mazes that are practically crapshoots, and because you only get 10 total opportunities to enter Sonic 1 special stages, there are significantly more chances the game continues in Sonic 2, with 17 total acts having result screens. On the other hand, no longer do you enter special stages by finishing an act with 50 rings and jumping into the giant golden ring. Instead, you do so by finding any of the level's checkpoints, touching it with 50 rings currently in stock, and jumping in this magical portal of spinning stars. After failing or succeeding at the special stage, you're reset to the checkpoint you used to enter said special stage, only with 0 rings in hand and all the rings having respawned in the level itself. This is less than ideal, because if you're going for the Chaos Emeralds, you'll be a lot more likely to miss out on those delicious continues as well as extra lives via 100 rings for that matter. In a zone like Emerald Hill, you are free to venture back to the start to get more rings, partially alleviating the issue, but most levels aren't very backtrackable at all, with earlier sections becoming inaccessible as you progress. If you are not going for the Chaos Emeralds, the way acquiring continues is handled is a step up compared to Sonic 1 in my opinion, but otherwise I am pretty undecided. I'm also undecided about whether I prefer Sonic 1's or Sonic 2's method of entering special stages. The latter does seem vastly superior at a glance though. Firstly, there are heaps and bounds more potential chances to enter special stages in Sonic 2, since there are multiple checkpoints in each act. If you know what you're doing, you can achieve all 7 Chaos Emeralds before you even pass Emerald Hill Zone. Let that sink in for a minute. Secondly, because checkpoints are spaced throughout the levels, odds are you don't need to carry 50 rings all the way to the signpost. This decreasement in distance to the next portal for a special stage can make quite the difference, especially considering the oh-so-well-established enemy and hazard placement quibbles. The drawback, however, is that finding checkpoints isn't very straightforward. Admittedly, you'll naturally stumble upon some checkpoints in Sonic 2 stages, and they should be taken full advantage of. But trust me, as a newcomer, you'll also need to actively hunt for them. Now, this extra incentive to explore is not the problem. Truth be told, I find it to be wonderful on paper, but due to how the zones tend to be designed, being semi-linear and here and there somewhat daunting and confusing to navigate, the process can end up taking a bit of time at best or being a big fat pain in the crack at worst. Imagine you find a checkpoint with less than 50 rings pocketed. You'd have to memorize the location first of all, then pray to Dark Gaia that you can properly backtrack there later, and just like in Sonic 1, carefully tiptoeing about is the only reliable method to prevent unexpected collision with crap. There are smaller design decisions here in Sonic 2 that bother me too. Why is your ring counter always reset to 0 after leaving a special stage even though you only need 50 to enter? What if I entered with over 100 rings? Tis all gone. Why do the transportation stars above checkpoints disappear when you accidentally off-screen them? The last thing you want to do is zoom past the checkpoint you didn't know was coming and thus jeopardize your opportunity for nabbing a Chaos Emerald. This does happen in practice and it makes nobody happy. What's most frustrating frustrating about everything is that all these problems surrounding the entering of special stages could have been patched up simply by implementing Sonic 3 and K's concept of giant rings scattered around in various secret locations. Perhaps that's hindsight logic, but it would have made accessing special stages a heck of a bunch more streamlined, as well as reserve your collected normal rings solely for the goal of scoring them extra lives and continues. As is, I suppose I still prefer Sonic 2's checkpoint system over Sonic 1's giant ring at signpost system, but that's only saying so much. What's worth noting then is that I probably would not have minded most of this as much as I do if the special stages themselves weren't based so much on road memorization. Jolly dear, they are now upon us. The concept for Sonic 2 special stages is one fans of the franchise are all too familiar with. Your character automatically runs forward in a half-pipe structure that can be controlled to the left or right to grab as many rings as possible, while avoiding bombs that take away 10 rings upon impact. Every special stage consists of 3 sections, each requiring you to have a certain amount of rings in order to pass on to the next section. Fall short of the asked ring count at any of the 3 gates and you're immediately kicked out. No Chaos Emerald for you. The concept itself isn't offensive. Sonic 3D Blast Saturn special stages are built on it and those play fine. It's the layouts of the special stages themselves in Sonic 2 in particular that suck. The courses frequently contain blind turns and elevation changes where a new player couldn't possibly guess what's coming up, and since the half-pipe is simulated 3D through the magic of pre-rendered polygons, reacting to objects can be a bit more difficult because of the draw distance and depth perception. Whenever you're going straight, it's all good and the turns do tend to telegraph where to move toward. If the course is bending to the left, chances are high that the next group of rings is located to the right, for instance. So there are some guidelines to follow here and there to help you out. It'll take a few stages before you properly understand them, however, and on so many occasions, it's all completely ignored anyway, notably in the later levels. I've played these special stages virtually my entire life, yet every now and then, I still find myself crashing into bombs popping up out of thin air, or jumping prematurely and therefore missing Casherino. Usually there is some leniency at the gates, allowing you to hit 1 or 2 bombs or miss some pockets of rings, but that doesn't change the fact that many of these special stages are plagued with hideous design. It's even worse if you play as Sonic and have Tails tagging along. You need more rings at all the gates to proceed, and Tails' AI does nothing but copy your inputs and execute them about 3/4 of a second later. The result? The two-tailed fox constantly slams into bombs because of that delay, and therefore causes you to lose. It's a disaster. Sonic plus Tails in the special stages is clearly meant for cooperative play where a second player can join in, but this is exactly the reason why I am not fond of Sonic plus Tails being the default setting. How are people supposed to know it's so disadvantageous when playing by themselves? All in all, if you're curious, I personally do prefer Sonic 2 special stages over Sonic 1's. The emphasis on trial and error was not the most interesting challenge they could have created, but at least there is some entertainment value to be found here once you know what you're doing. Once more though, what am I even comparing here? They're both meant to be tech demos first and foremost for the wow factor. That being said, the payoff in store for getting all the Chaos Emeralds, up from 6 to 7, not sure why, is much better this time around. Supersonic. Once you stock up 50 rings in any given stage, the game's God mode can be activated by jumping. In this stage, you can jump higher, your speed is increased, and you're invincible to all touch damage as the cherry on top. You can still get crushed and fall into bottomless pits though, so the game isn't broken quite entirely, and your ring counter operates as a timer that ticks down, 1 second per ring. Reach 0 and you'll have to regather 50 rings to transform into Supersonic again. Honestly, blazing around as the Golden Hedgehog is pure bliss, and an appropriately satisfying reward for all the hard work you put into conquering those darn special stages. And I think it's a shame most future installments in the franchise limit Supersonic to story-related boss fights and whatnot. If there's anything I'll criticize, it has to be that you cannot decide not to turn into Supersonic once you do unlock him. I mean, you're inevitably going to jump, so I would have appreciated needing to hit the action button again mid-air or something to give you the choice. The track that plays is also also a mere 20-second loop that continues non-stop as long as you're Supersonic, which is mind-numbingly monotonous and regrettably could drive people to mute the audio. I would have preferred for the developers to have altered the main stage themes in some fashion instead, like different instrumentation or revamped drum lines. Anything but that gear grinding loop. Tails does not have a super form at all, sadly, for one reason or another, which is quite the middle finger and the other significant difference between the two characters I was referring to at the beginning of the video. I think Tails lacking a super form is plain stupid, period, and his ending doesn't even change a single hitch with all the Chaos Emeralds. At least Sonic's ending with all the Chaos Emeralds acknowledges your achievement in some way. It's subjective though whether it actually provides more rewarding closure to your journey or not. It's going to be tricky for me to come up with a proper verdict for Sonic the Hedgehog 2. When I compare it to Sonic 1, the adventure feels massive and a lot more varied due to the increased number of zones. The actual level designs themselves are built around the physics and momentum-based mechanics much more competently from start to finish, and the overall speed and pace of the game have been cranked up. All of this makes it easy to understand why this installment is widely preferred over the original, and why Sonic 2 is such a general classic held in high regard. It's a real shame then that the game was rushed and comes with some sizable negatives. Scrapped content is one thing, it's a fate many, if not most titles suffer from, but the hope was that the unfair moments encountered in Sonic 1 would have largely been tackled and left behind here. Unfortunately, that isn't really the case, and it's arguably become worse. Sonic 2 contains a dangerous level of trial and error, accentuated by the limited continues fiasco, and the special stages remain poor all around. These flaws do hurt the final product and ultimately make it less accessible than it could have been. None of that negates the excellence present in many of the game's other aspects though. It is not going to be for everybody, but those who can get past or have gotten past the learning curve and memorization required to make Sonic 2 truly shine can indulge in an immensely unique experience that is both very satisfying and highly replayable, even more so than the original. The original is more finished and less arbitrarily difficult, making it debatably the better game, but the sequel has a superior grasp of Sonic's core appeal throughout. For that reason, in addition to the enhanced diversity and sexier graphics and soundtrack, I can't help but like playing the sequel more and classifying it as an improved Sonic game despite some setbacks. Now, if you want to have the supreme Sonic the Hedgehog 2 experience, do yourself a favor and pick up the 2013 enhanced remake available on iOS and Android devices. It's only $3 as of the time of this video, boasts a 16:9 aspect ratio, making for improved visibility and thus less surprise moments, and even has a save feature, which means you only have to replay the current act instead of the whole game when you get a game over. Seriously, these additions go a long way in smoothing over Sonic 2's flaws and therefore make it a more enjoyable game for noobs and veterans alike. This version of Sega's 1992 hot seller is a great 2D platformer, and a separate video covering all these Taxman and Stealth remakes in depth will come after reviewing Sonic CD. Thank you for watching, my name has been Retrapo Bay, and I certainly hope you have some damn well-deserved fun today.